First of all, what's your understanding of why the Assad regime fell so fast now?
Well, there are a lot of people out there telling various stories about it. You've spent time in the Middle East, so have I. You know the lay of the land. You can, as the Israelis have discovered, as we've discovered, buy off large numbers of people if you're smart and you're patient and you know who to talk to. You know, this should not come as a big surprise. So I'm sure that large numbers of officers and probably senior NCOs and soldiers were purchased right there at the beginning or in the months leading up to it. So that's not surprising. The second thing is we've practically destroyed Syria. The only income-producing capability on Syrian soil is up in the area that the Kurds control and that we occupy, the oil fields. And that oil has been sold on the black market and spirited down to Israel. And the Kurds have benefited enormously from that because they want to build their own independent state. And that's not lost on anybody that knows the region right now. And that's another issue we should address in the future. So I don't think we should be very surprised by it. In fact, the big income generator, if you will, was drug trafficking in and through Syria, largely championed by the Syrian army, because they just haven't got any cash. They haven't got any money. The place is impoverished. So the fact that it fell apart quickly was not surprising, but it was done in a way that I don't think we, not necessarily us, but certainly not the Russians or the Iranians anticipated. And it was a master stroke. Now we'll talk about this master stroke strategically, what it means for the two principal winners. One is Mr. Netanyahu, and the other is Mr. Erdogan, because those are the two standout, beneficiaries of what's now occurred.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about both of those, but before we do, that there's one other entity that wants to set up and say, no, that actually we're the ones who did this. This is a great deal for us. Here's what President Biden said when they asked to explain how all this happened.
For years, the main backers of Assad have been Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia. But over the last week, their support collapsed, all three of them, because all three of them are far weaker today than they were when I took office. Our approach has shifted the balance of power in the Middle East. Through this combination of support for our partners, sanctions, diplomacy, and targeted military force when necessary, we now see new opportunities opening up for the people of Syria and for the entire region.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I see a lot of opportunities for the Syrian people as a result of all of our militant policies over the years here. How do you see that?
Well, no one in Washington cares about the people living in Syria any more than they care about the Ukrainians. Let's be frank. People in Washington and the CIA and at the top of the government, and to a lesser extent, they're big supporters on the Hill and big donors, are engaged in a strategic chess game, and they're very proud of themselves. And they think that they've won in this master stroke. So listen, he's telling you somewhat the truth. But this really began under Obama. Obama was the architect. I don't want to say he was the architect, but this all began under him. And the whole process of repurposing the Al-Qaeda, ISIS terrorists, reforming them, rebranding them, and representing them in a new form that could be useful to the West, to Europe, and the United States is what's happened. Now, I think we're going to be surprised about the long-term consequences. Remember, ISIS was also something that was dear and near to the heart of President Erdogan in Turkey, until suddenly ISIS began to turn on them and on others in the region. And slowly people saw the wisdom of driving it out. Well, it was never completely exterminated, and it's almost impossible to do that in the Middle East. The Middle East is a place with lots of porous borders, lots of patrons who are willing to support various factions. So you're never going to crush any of these organizations, whether it's ISIS or Hamas or Hezbollah, completely out of existence. But I think what he has said is that the desire is to fundamentally change the Middle East. That has happened. And we need to talk about that because Americans are not in the least interested in most cases. And they are going to watch as this may come back to bite us and everybody else in the future.
Before we look at the Israel and Turkey specifically, I want to look at the instrument that was used by all those who were supporting him, and that is HTS and Jolani. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what you know about him and what you think could happen later, because just a real brief, in the 2004-5 era, he actually fought against the United States as part of the insurgency in Iraq and was put in jail there for a while, and then later became affiliated with al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate, then later with ISIS, then kind of repudiated them. Now he's saying these days that he's a moderate guy and that he's not going to persecute the Christians or the Druze or any of these other folks. He just wants to govern effectively. First of all, do you think that he has actually changed, and what do you think is going to happen with him going forward?
Well, Dan, I'm not an Arabist, and I don't claim to be an expert on events and peoples in the Middle East. My view of all of this is largely strategic. He's a useful tool right now to us, more specifically to President Erdogan. He was turned, if you will, with what? Cash? Promises of power and influence. I mean, this is a man who led a group of people that just a couple of years ago were selling women on the streets of towns in Syria for $10 a piece. This is someone who has been active in the beheadings, the mass rapes, the mass murder of anybody that he and his band of Islamist thugs didn't care for. These are the people that, you know, most Americans would be repelled by if they looked at it very closely, but they turned out to be useful to us. My point is, I don't think anything's changed in his mind, and I think now he's very focused once again on the things he was focused previously on, and that is going back into Iraq. And we need to understand that once they've gained control of most of Syria, then it will be northern Iraq, and they're already moving in those directions. And I think the Iraqis know that. This is a major war developing. Now, how far will he get? Well, he has the backing of Turkish military power. He has the support in terms of close air support of Turkish armed drones. And there are Turkish intelligence officers who are not just helping to guide him and move his forces where they can make great gains in a short period of time. And you know what the desert is like. You can go a long distance very quickly in any number of places. It may or may not mean much. But the point is, this is not a new Renaissance man. These are not diversity sensitive people. That's all nonsense. That's for external consumption. I saw this kind of nonsense go on in the Balkans with the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was nothing more than a Stalinist drug mafia. And that certainly was transformed into Jeffersonian Democrats. You know, we do this all the time. Whoever the enemy is demonized, and whoever is doing our bidding is suddenly a liberal Renaissance character. It's a lot of nonsense. This is all about power, and the power is now split largely between Israel and Turkey.
Okay, yeah, and let's actually look
one camp or another.
Let's look at that then. Now let's go in the Turkish area first. So overnight, I think the Syrian National Army, which is a Turkish-backed group, has taken Manbij and are threatening to take even more territory that is currently, or has been anyway, operated by the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Kurds. How far do you think that the Turks want to go in there, and will the Turkish armed forces themselves actually end up being engaged?
Well, we don't know what was informally agreed to or formally agreed to between Israel and Turkey. We know that the head of Shin Bet just a couple of weeks ago, or 3 or 4 weeks ago, was in Ankara for talks. And a lot of us looked at that and surmised that something was happening, but we couldn't quite put our fingers on it. This was a grandiose plan that was hatched in order to decapitate everybody's enemy. Who's everybody's enemy? Iran, its proxies, Hezbollah, the Shiites. And so you have the Sunni Muslim leader of the Sunni Muslim world, de facto, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, Erdogan, who has sat down now with his Israeli counterparts, and the Israelis want this thing called Greater Israel. And he's taken the position, that's fine. You can have Greater Israel. This is what we want. Now, I don't know where that line of demarcation between where Turkish power and influence ends and where Israeli power and influence begins. But I can tell you that the effects of the Islamists and Mr. Erdogan, who's backing them, are being felt now in Jordan and all the way to Egypt. And they're starting to make their presence felt down in Iraq. And I think the people in the Emirates are also watching, as are the Saudis. They are not necessarily cheering, and they certainly aren't anxious to rush over into the arms of Israel or Turkey at this stage. But I think what we're looking at is essentially two men with two, at least at the moment, complementary visions strategically of what each wants in the region. We support one of them. We don't necessarily support Erdogan, but we're helpful to him insofar as he serves our purposes. And right now, since he's anti-Iranian, anti-Shiite, and willing to do business with Israel, we're willing to do business with him. The question is, how long does this last?
And one of the other questions, especially when Trump enters office here, is what to do about the U.S. troops in Syria, in the area where the Syrian Democratic Forces, and what does he do with the Syrian Democratic Forces themselves? Does he just abandon them? Does he say, y'all just got to make your own deals? How does Trump manage that? Because there's some feedback, fallback, pushback that could come as a result of that because of how long we've been there. Though
sure.
You and I have been arguing they should leave for a long time ago, but that's what he's going to have to face. How is that going to work out?
Well, the Kurds, of course, if you look at the map, and it's largely accurate, you have it's usually in yellow. I can't really see the map that you're showing, or maybe it's green now. I don't know which it is. But the point is that the western, southwestern, northeastern, southeastern and northeastern portions of Syria are largely under the control of Kurdish fighters, Kurdish independence fighters. They were anti-Islamist and did cooperate on a limited basis with Assad when it was in their interest to do so, because they didn't want to fall under Turkish hegemony. Well, now that's gone. Assad is gone. The forces that he commanded are gone. And what they have on their flanks are Islamists, Sunni Islamists, Arabs, Uzbeks, Tajiks, Kazakhs, and so forth, professional jihadists. And they have the Turkish military. And if there's one thing that President Erdogan would like to do, and I think most Turks would like to see, is the Kurdish threat to Turkey eliminated. And as long as you have what effectively amounts to an independent or autonomous Kurdish state, this is something that the Turks cannot possibly tolerate over the long run. Now, that means that the Iranians, and some of the Kurds are Shiites, the Iranians will undoubtedly offer support to the Kurds at this stage of the game. Whether or not that will help much is unclear. We'll be in a difficult position because we have told the Kurds that we're going to support them. And we have, but it may turn out to be in our interest to leave, in which case we're turning them over and the region over to the Turks. This is the kind of thing that we don't really understand. And right now, and I just want to throw this out so people are aware of it, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Azerbaijan and the Turks, the Azeri Turks in Azerbaijan, are virtually identical with the Turks that live in Anatolia, are looking at seizing the corridor that is controlled by Armenia right now that links Azerbaijan with Turkey. Mr. Erdogan refers to Azerbaijan and Turkey as two states and one nation. Azerbaijan is very close and has done a lot of work with the Israelis. The Israelis have supported them in their war against the Armenian Christians. And I suspect that in any real knockdown, drag-out war with Iran, that the Israelis will utilize the bases and locations inside Azerbaijan to ensure that there is a strong second front against Iran, or in Azerbaijan against Iran. So this is rapidly spreading and becoming finally a truly regional war, but it's still on the escalatory ladder. It's at the low end right now, but it could rise very, very quickly, almost overnight. And the Israelis are now eyeing Damascus. That too was identified as part of the Greater Israel Project.
Yeah, that's actually where I wanted to go next. In fact, the news this morning is that Israel has been on its massive bombing campaign, wiping out the Syrian Navy and wiping out a lot of their military bases, their armament capabilities, tanks, artillery pieces, ammunition storage warehouses. Literally, they're just taking out everything militarily. While, if you can throw that other map up there, while they're starting to move beyond the Golan Heights and as you say, in the direction of Damascus, it's unclear right now. And the Israelis have said nothing about what their territorial ambitions are. But how far do you think they could go in there? And is there a risk for them overextending and having too much of an appetite?
Well, if you look at Damascus, its location, it's actually quite close to the Israeli border. You can drive to Damascus on a good road in an hour, maybe a little more, but not much. So reaching Damascus quickly is not difficult. There's also not much between the Israeli border and Damascus. There are some villages, but they're very small, inconsequential. And from the Israeli standpoint, you could brush them off like you would fleas. The problem is that Damascus, like Jerusalem, is another great city in the Muslim world. These are places that are part of Islamic civilization, just as Baghdad was, so is Damascus, Cairo, and of course, Jerusalem. So I don't know what kind of effect that would have. That's a question you'll have to ask Mr. Netanyahu. I'm sure he would love to take Damascus and hold it, but would that suddenly interrupt his good relations with the Turks? I suspect it probably would. So it's hard to tell, but the point is that the Greater Israel Project that I would argue just a couple of weeks ago was DOA has now had real life breathed into it by the collapse of the Assad regime. And remember, we have puppets in Cairo and we have a puppet in Jordan. These puppets are paid off handsomely, and they are obedient to our will with regard to Israel. Now, Sisi is an amazing man. I'm surprised he's still alive because his population wants to go to war. I'm sure he has good security, and he's probably killed everybody that could possibly compete with him. But I wouldn't rule out that he could suddenly vanish from the screen if he continues on the same path, because right now he is purely a U.S.-Israeli puppet. Abdullah is in a different position. He's hostage to the Israelis for water for his country. The Israelis can cut off the water, and suddenly millions of people are going to die of thirst in Jordan, frankly. So I think Jordan is going to remain in this uneasy position, but the Islamists don't care about those things. And the Islamists will penetrate that Jordanian border as though there's nothing there. And once they move into that area, you could see chaos in Jordan as well. The point is that Israel has to be careful because what they think they can take and digest could, as you point out, be too much at this stage, and they could end up with more trouble on their flanks than they think. Remember that Hamas is not dead. It's been severely wounded, but it's not dead. And they have not succeeded in killing or driving out all of the Palestinian Arabs in Gaza. And they still want to do the same thing to the people living on the West Bank.
Right.
Because you only have so many forces, you can only stretch them so far. But the assumption has always been that people in the Middle East can be bribed, bullied, or bombed into submission. Well, I think the bribing and the bullying has reached almost its limits, and the bombing now has a serious effect, but I don't think the effect is going to be quite what it's been in the past. You're running out of really weak opponents and adversaries. You're going to start seeing some real resistance. And I'm talking primarily about the Iranians, their proxies in Iraq, as well as Kurdish elements and the Turks. These are serious people. They'll fight. It could get very, very bloody. Now, again, from an Israeli standpoint, they always look at their neighbors and celebrate whenever they kill each other. But the question is, what happens when that stops? Yeah. What happens when some new modus vivendi is reached? Do the Turks suddenly turn their gaze further to the west and look at Israel? There's nothing that would make Erdogan happier than to present himself as the savior of Islam and the liberator of the Islamic holy sites in Jerusalem.
Well, we'll certainly have to wait and see how that happens, and pray that it never comes to fruition. That just remains a distant aspiration. In the last few minutes we have here, though, I want to look at U.S. interests in particular. One of the things I've been arguing since really the first Trump administration all the way through has been our troops in Syria and Iraq especially are nothing but points of vulnerability, and we need to withdraw them all. But apparently that's not the view of the elite foreign policy, so-called, in the United States. And the outgoing administration seems to want to put a card on the ground here to say, hey, incoming administration, keep your hands off the troops there because they're desperately needed. Here's what Jake Sullivan said in trying to make the case to keep the troops there.
We have a presence both in Iraq and in Syria. That presence in Syria is there to work hand in hand with local partners to continue to suppress the threat that ISIS has posed going back many years now. And we've had significant progress in that fight just even in the last few months. Major players taken off the battlefield, large-scale degradation of those ISIS forces. But of course, an event like this happens, and ISIS immediately looks to take advantage. And we have seen reports of ISIS trying out in the Syrian Badia, the desert, to try to reconstitute to a certain extent. So we will continue to take action against that. And we will continue to make sure that force protection, the protection of our service members who are serving at a range of bases in eastern Syria, is the paramount concern from the president on down. The threat to those service members is not just from ISIS or from this violence. It is also from Iranian-backed Shia militia groups who themselves could try to take advantage of this. And so we are also doing what we believe we need to do to prepare for, deter, and protect against any potential attacks from that group of actors, which of course we have seen over the course of the past few years, and which we under the Biden administration have responded to at several points with direct strikes against those forces, both in Syria and in Iraq.
He makes the case that those troops there actually have combat power and that they can be used to defend American interest if they needed to be. But we're talking about roughly 2,500 in Iraq and 900 in all that vast expanse of Syria that you talked about a minute ago, and they're not doing anything there. So why do we want to keep those troops in there, and what do you think Trump will do about it?
Well, he was, let us say, just to be polite, rather disingenuous about a number of things. First of all, we, that is the CIA, and I think MI6 from Britain, have had a hand in rebranding ISIS and all of these radical Islamists and making them into something else, at least on the surface, so that they could be utilized to attack the enemies that we have chosen. And those enemies are Iran and its Shiite supporters. So insofar as we've had a hand in that, I think it's a little ridiculous for him to say, well, we're keeping an eye on this because ISIS will take advantage of it. ISIS is there. ISIS is us, okay? And ISIS does have their eyes on Tikrit, on Mosul, on Kirkuk in northern Iraq, which of course are cities of great interest to the Turks, who view those cities as Turkish anyway. So if anything, what we've done now is we put the Kurds in this unenviable position of becoming a target for the Turkish military in the near future. The Turks now have the opportunity to flank and surround the Kurds down in Syria and drive headlong into them and throw them out of Syria entirely. And I think these are things that are being considered. As I said, on Turkish television, you see all these depictions of Greater Turkey, or, you know, the neo-Ottoman Turkish sphere of influence. All of it's readily available. I also disagree with him in terms of his strategic interests. We have always had an interest basically in two things. We have an interest in the flow of oil, maintaining the commercial access for ourselves and everybody else in the region, and in the preservation of Israel as a state. We have essentially said that's our national interest, which is one of the reasons I and several others were very critical of this terrible campaign in Gaza, because I don't think that's the way for Israel to survive. I think it's a way for Israel to go in the opposite direction, because no one in the region has forgotten that. Everyone in the region knows that they are, in the Israeli eyes, Amalek and subhuman. That's not a mystery. That's not gone away, and that's going to plague Israel as long as it exists. So I have a disagreement with what's strategically important. We need good relations with the Emirates, with Saudi Arabia, the various other players in the oil business. We want to keep that flowing, and we want to see Israel survive. The rest of this that he's talking about is nonsense. So I agree with you. I think at some point we're in a very difficult position. And that is probably going to be once the Turks have consolidated power and influence in Syria and begun to expand it into Iraq and Jordan. And those things are underway. It's going to take time. Same thing is true to a lesser extent for the Israelis. They've got to consolidate and control whatever they take over. And that may not be easy. They may think so at this point, but it may not be. And again, the further you move away from your, let us say, your logistical supply points or your base, the more vulnerable you become. And moving all the way to Damascus may be very appealing and be greeted with cheers in Israel, but it creates new vulnerabilities. It raises new questions, and it potentially damages Israel's relations with others, particularly Turkey.
And in the last few minutes here, what is the risk for the United States if we don't withdraw those troops out of Syria? And they're there allegedly to help, to work hand in glove with the Syrian Democratic Forces, and the Turkish forces start moving out. We could be put in the position to where we may have to decide either to abandon the Syrian Democratic Forces or to actually fight the Turkish forces. What risk is there of that?
Well, I think the risk is very high, and I would dump all these terms that talk about democracy. That's all nonsense. There's no democracy anywhere. We ought to just forget it. The Turks want to rid themselves of the Kurdish problem. That's an inevitability. We're sitting there tied to the Kurds. So answer your own question. At some point, that becomes very dangerous for us. And if you expect the Israelis to intervene to save the Kurds or save us, you're out of your mind. That's not even up for discussion. They're going to sit on what they've got and what they think they can hold in the context of greater Israel. So they're not going to do anything. So we're on our own. And I agree with you. I've never liked these penny packets of U.S. soldiers on the ground. I don't care how many mercenaries are with them. I don't care how many intelligence officials are out there. It's very dangerous. And I think it could blow up in our faces. Not immediately, but over time. And again, who anticipated what we saw happen in Syria? Maybe somebody in the intelligence community knew about it. Certainly in the CIA, they knew this is what they were working for, but nobody was going to warn anyone or tell anything about anything because we wanted this to happen. Well, it's happened. We've created this new whirlwind. The question is, do we escape from it, or are we going to be consumed by it? It's too soon to tell. And the same question has to be answered by the Israelis.
Indeed, it does. And we'll leave it there for now. But we are going to keep a close eye on this and look forward to having you back real soon to talk about whatever happens next as we get closer to that date. So first of all, just thank you for coming back on. We always appreciate you coming here. But before we let you go, actually, wonders, is there anything new in Our Country, Our Choice? What's happening with your organization down there?
Well, I think most of our members are getting ready for Christmas. We're trying to prepare for some things. We're trying to put some shows together for January 2025, and we're continuing to build out and expand this Republic platform. And as I always say, that is the free speech instrument inside the United States from which you can't be censored or thrown off. So whatever you do, get on that platform, because once you join as a member, you have a communications network that is readily made for you and your organization and the people like you that will reach everyone all over the country. In fact, we're seeing more and more people from abroad take an interest in this and try to figure out how they can essentially extend it into their countries, places like Sweden, Germany, Austria, even France, Italy. So we'll see. It's very exciting. And I invite everybody to go to Republic and look it over, see what's there. I think you'll like it. And it's time to get on the ground floor as this thing grows. I only see it growing larger. I don't see anything to hold it back.
Well, that's awesome. We certainly applaud that and recommend people go and do that. We're actually going to have some materials to be sharing with our folks here. We have a lot of international folks watch this, and the fact that it's not just something for the United States, I think will appeal to a lot of them, and we'll be sharing some of those details in the very near future as well. So thanks for coming on, Doug, and thanks for all this update. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan.
And we appreciate you guys too. Be sure and like and subscribe to our channel if you're new to it. If you haven't been here before, we'd love to have you come back. Also, let you know that at 3 o'clock this afternoon, U.S. Eastern time, Larry Johnson's going to be coming on, and he's going to look at the back at this situation in Syria from a different lens and perspective of, has the U.S. been supporting freedom or sponsoring terrorism in this situation here? The answers may disturb some people, but if you want the truth, turn back in today at 3 p.m., and we'll see you then on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.